Welcome to part two of the Articles of Confederation. In part one, we talked about what the Articles of Confederation were as a written constitution, how they were set up as a loose affiliation of states, and they were really trying hard not to be like Britain. They didn't want all their power in one place. And now we're going to look a little bit as to the successes of the Articles, as well as look a lot at the failures of the Articles of Confederation. So, if we were to kind of weigh out the successes of the Articles of Confederation, there's really only two. One is that it just created a legitimate national government for the nation. They had all their various state governments, but to work collectively, they had to have a national government. Whereas during the war, before the Declaration of Independence, they really weren't a legal body, the Continental Congress. Now they're a legitimate government that could say it speaks on behalf of the people. Secondly, the Articles of Confederation created a couple of really important laws, the Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Now, when we talk about the Northwest, we really mean this area here you see in black on the map: Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, parts of what is Minnesota today. We're really talking about what is kind of Northwest Virginia, if you will. And this was new territory for the United States. It wasn't created into states yet. But what the Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance did was, first off, help to organize these territories into states. And what that means is they came up with a plan in which, when people moved to these places, there was a plan in which they could become states. So, in other words, when the population of one of these territories reached a certain point, say 60,000, it could do certain things, create a judiciary system or a court system. And it got to a certain point, it could do other things as well. It also, if you look at the diagram on the right here, you'll see that they came up with a really organized system for creating towns. And so they basically had these rectangular or square chunks of land. And, they would say that each one was someone's lot. They would talk about how they were divided into various sections. So they made it kind of really fair for people buying land, that sort of thing, and really created a very organized system that would be applied later as Americans start to move beyond the Mississippi River and all the way to the Pacific Ocean, in the long run. Secondly, in these territories, they outlawed slavery. So it kind of set a precedent for the future that would lead to a lot of debate and conflict between slave and non-slave states. But it set a precedent that newer lands, at least at first, were not going to have slavery, and that's pretty important. But in all of that, those are really the only successes of the Articles of Confederation. And so, as we look at those successes, we start to then look at the failures, the things that really outweighed those successes. And one of the first is that there's no central leader to, in a sense, enforce laws. Now, part of that problem is, if you look at the diagram below, that was kind of the way Massachusetts and Connecticut and other New England states set up their governments. So they had a single house, they had a very specific system, the way things were set up. And you don't really have to see the details. But if you compare it to Virginia's system on the right, it has a two-house legislature. It's organized in a very different way. So there was no central system, as each state had very different ways of doing things. This also meant it was very difficult to make laws because there was nobody really making decisions about how to enforce any of the laws in the United States. Secondly, because they were, in a sense, so decentralized, it was really difficult to collect taxes, close to impossible. And what that means is that if you can't collect taxes, you can't do things like raise a military to protect the people, and you can't, build roads between states, that sort of thing. And I mentioned the military, and that really was another big issue. It also meant, with this decentralized government, it was hard to create any kind of foreign policy, meaning there was no single way to deal with foreign nations. They all kind of disagreed over it. and there was no kind of final decision on that. Then there was the fact that being a loose alliance of states, it was hard to solve their various disputes. So they passed laws against each other. They wouldn't accept each other's currency. Yes, they had different currency. And they made it very difficult for trade to happen amongst the states. So it really made for kind of a financial mess as well. And lastly, the thing that kind of tipped it to where they said, we've got to fix this, was an incident called Shays' Rebellion. And that's what we're going to pick up in the next video and look in more detail at Shays' Rebellion and how that led them to decide to first fix the Articles of Confederation and then finally decide to scrap them all together and to write a completely new constitution.